The Boston wind was howling like a wounded animal against the frost-covered glass of my kitchen window, rattling the frames with a violent, freezing fury. It was 5:14 a.m. on a brutal November morning, the kind of weather that cuts straight to the bone, but the deepest freeze in that house didn't come from the blizzard raging outside. It came from a single sharp ping of my phone, resting quietly on the cold granite island. Some betrayals announce themselves with a screaming match, broken plates, and slamming doors. Mine came with an automated bank alert. I picked up the phone, rubbing the exhaustion from my eyes, and stared down at the glowing screen. It was a wire transfer notification from the specialized medical trust fund I had spent over a decade meticulously building and guarding for my wife, Eleanor. The balance, which was strictly secured to guarantee her round-the-clock Alzheimer's care and safety for the rest of her days, was completely wiped out, zeroed out. $340,000 vanished into thin air in the dead of night. The authorization signature authorizing the plunder? My own 35-year-old son, Marcus. Before we go any further into how a father dismantles a greedy son's life piece by piece, let me ask you a simple question. If you believe in protecting the vulnerable over enabling the entitled, if you believe that real justice is a quiet paper trail rather than loud, useless arguments, do us one quick favor and hit that subscribe button. Welcome to Dad's Ultimate Payback. I didn't throw the phone across the room. I didn't scream or curse at the empty walls. I simply poured my black coffee, sat down at the heavy oak stool, and let the heavy silence of the house wash over me. But the true stomach-churning depth of Marcus's depravity hadn't even fully revealed itself yet. At exactly 7 a.m., my phone rang again. It was Mrs. Higgins, the director of Eleanor's specialized medical care facility. Her voice was thick with hesitant sympathy as she apologized for the sudden notice, informing me that the private transport team was already downstairs preparing to move Eleanor out by noon as requested. I felt the blood completely stop in my veins. Move her out? Marcus hadn't just drained the account to fund his selfish lifestyle. To cover his tracks, buy time, and delay the bank's strict fraud protocols, he had called the facility the evening before, viciously impersonating my voice. He had officially canceled Eleanor's VIP medical suite to trigger an immediate refund of her massive care security deposit, directing the check straight to his own newly formed shell company. But that wasn't the worst of it. To hide her completely while he finalized his schemes during the storm, he had arranged to secretly transfer my sick, memory-faded wife to a notorious, rundown, utterly unqualified budget nursing home tucked away in an isolated, snow-choked industrial suburb miles outside the city. He was treating his own mother like discarded trash, risking her life in the freezing blizzard just to cover his tracks. If he had succeeded, I would have lost track of Eleanor entirely in the middle of a historic disaster. My son, my own flesh and blood, had orchestrated a plan that could have killed her. He thought I was just a tired, distracted old man. He thought the daily heartbreak of watching his mother slip away to Alzheimer's had broken my mind and softened my edge. He had absolutely no idea that before I retired to become Eleanor's full-time caretaker, I spent 35 years as a forensic auditor for the IRS, hunting down ghosts and breaking white-collar liars for a living. Sitting there in that freezing kitchen, listening to the snow beat against the glass, the grieving husband and father inside me stepped aside, and the auditor went violently, quietly to work. For 42 years, Eleanor had been the quiet anchor and the very center of my world. I still remember the bright, unclouded summer afternoon in Maryland when we first crossed paths, her laughter ringing out clear and vibrant, completely unburdened by the cruel weight of time. But Alzheimer's is a thief that works in slow, agonizing motion, stealing away a person's essence one fragile memory at a time. Lately, her brilliant, luminous mind had been swallowed entirely by a thick, unyielding fog. There were days she could no longer recall what year it was, or why the herbal tea was growing cold in her favorite ceramic mug on the kitchen counter. Yet in the quietest, most vulnerable hours of the evening, when the house grew dead still and the Boston shadows lengthened across the worn wooden floor, she would look at me with a sudden, haunting vacancy in her eyes. It was a terrifying, desolate look, the gaze of someone hopelessly stranded in a strange, terrifying country with no map home. But then she would find my hand, her frail, trembling fingers locking onto mine with a desperate, crushing grip. That handshake was the singular lifeline of my existence. I had sworn solemn vows in sickness and in health, and I meant every single syllable of it down to my bones. Keeping her safe in our home with professional, round-the-clock medical care was the only mission that mattered to me now. Marcus, however, existed on an entirely different, toxic plane of reality. My 35-year-old son was a man who loved the empty aesthetic of wealth without ever lifting a finger to do the heavy grinding labor required to earn it. He adored the clean lines of a tailored suit, the elite prestige of high-end business dinners, and the effortless social currency of appearing successful, but he utterly despised the grueling years of disciplines, sweat, and integrity it took to build an actual foundation. I had spent my entire life constructing the load-bearing walls of our family, paying for his out-of-state college tuition without a single hesitation and co-signing the mortgage on his first home, desperately hoping he would learn the value of an honest dollar. Instead, he treated my lifelong sacrifices as an endless guaranteed line of credit, treating me like a convenience rather than a father. Yet, the true, venomous sickness of the betrayal didn't end with my son's selfish greed. When I finally began digging into the legal documents, reviewing the fraudulent paperwork filed behind my back while I was distracted by Eleanor's failing health, a much darker truth came to light. The power of attorney document that Marcus had weaponized to drain his mother's life-saving medical fund hadn't just been notarized by some random stranger. It bore the official signature and stamp of a local attorney named Greg. Greg wasn't an outsider. 20 years ago, he was a bright, eager young recruit whom I had personally mentored, trained, and taken under my wing during my 35-year tenure as a forensic auditor for the IRS. I had taught him the complex nuances of financial tracking, treating him almost like a second son, guiding his career when he had nothing. And now he had sold out my lifelong trust and weaponized the law for a quick, dirty payoff. It was a vicious, calculated double betrayal, orchestrated by my own flesh and blood and executed by the very hands I had once raised up. Sitting at my desk in the quiet, freezing morning light, the full weight of their deception settled over me with absolute clarity. They both looked at me and saw a blind, broken old man who wouldn't look too closely at the fine print. They had absolutely no idea what kind of structural storm they had just invited into their lives. Revenge is loud, justice is quiet. That was the foundational rule I lived by during those 3 agonizing weeks following the discovery of the theft, and I adhered to it with absolute, unbending discipline. I didn't storm into Marcus's luxury apartment. I didn't call him on the phone to scream, curse, or demand an immediate explanation. And I didn't rush to make an emotional scene. When you are dealing with a parasite of Marcus's calculated caliber, making noise only tips your hand, spooks the target, and gives them precious room to wiggle away or hide their tracks. Instead, I simply poured myself another cup of black coffee, sat back down at my heavy oak desk, and let the quiet, clinical focus of my old professional life take complete control. I wasn't just an aging, grieving father nursing a deeply broken heart anymore. I stepped right back into the rigorous, unflinching mindset of a forensic auditor who had spent 35 years hunting down hidden assets, following untraceable paper trails and breaking white-collar liars for the IRS. I began gathering evidence with a chilling, mathematical precision, methodistically tearing down every layer of his deception. To uncover the true depth of his corruption, I discreetly hired a seasoned, ruthless private investigator to trace every single cent of Eleanor's stolen care fund, tracking the wire paths through shell companies and hidden ledgers. What the private investigator ultimately uncovered made my blood run cold, revealing a reality far darker and more depraved than a simple failed tech venture or standard financial greed. Marcus hadn't used a single dollar to build a legitimate business. Instead, he had blown $100, 0-0 on a brand new Porsche Cayenne to impress his shallow social circle, dropped another $100,000 as a heavy down payment on a luxury condo down in Miami, and the remaining $140,000. It had vanished straight into the pockets of a ruthless underground gambling syndicate to pay off a massive, life-threatening debt he had accumulated at illegal tables. My son was playing a deeply dangerous game with violent, vicious men, and if he didn't clear that staggering balance immediately, he was going to find himself in catastrophic physical danger. Any other father, any ordinary man burdened by a blind, unconditional paternal instinct, might have panicked right then and there, rushed in to rescue his reckless child, and bailed him out of the fire one last time. But as I sat there in the utter silence of that room, studying the horrifying financial trail spread out before me, I made my final, unshakable calculation. I wasn't going to save him from the disaster he had built with his own hands. I was going to use his exact desperation, his reckless greed, and his criminal entanglements to lock the structural cage door behind him and tighten the legal noose until there was nowhere left for him to run. Thanksgiving evening in our neighborhood was always wrapped in a deep, bone-chilling quiet, the kind of holiday carved out by frosted window panes and the distant, muffled hum of traffic fading into the freezing Boston night. But outside my driveway, that silent dignity was shattered by the aggressive, unmistakable roar of a brand new, high-end Porsche Cayenne. It sat parked right in front of my modest, weathered porch, a glaring, obnoxious symbol of stolen wealth, gleaming aggressively under the amber street lamp like a middle finger pointing straight at the load-bearing walls I had spent decades building. When the front door swung open, Marcus walked in with the swagger of a man who genuinely believed he had conquered the world. He was draped in a tailored $2,000 suit, his dark hair meticulously styled, wearing the smug, self-satisfied grin of someone completely intoxicated by his own supposed business brilliance. He didn't even bother taking off his heavy winter coat before he started in, leaning down to kiss his mother on the cheek with calculated, empty indifference, and dropping an expensive, heavy bottle of bourbon onto the old wooden hallway table like a cheap tip. "Business is booming, Dad," Marcus declared, his voice echoing loudly and disrespectfully through the quiet house as he unbuttoned his jacket. "Just closed a massive multi-million-dollar round of funding for the firm today. Honestly, you really should have trusted my vision and invested when I asked you months ago. But you're getting old, Dad. You just don't understand how modern capital or real wealth works anymore." He wasn't alone in his arrogance. Right behind him stepped Chloe, his shallow, gold-digging fiancée, who had clearly come tonight with one explicit goal: to stake her final claim on a property and a future she hadn't earned a single fraction of. The moment she crossed our threshold, Chloe wrinkled her sharp nose in open disgust, letting out a dramatic, theatrical sigh as she looked around our lived-in, unpretentious home. She began complaining out loud about the faint, medicinal scent of care supplies lingering softly in the air, treating Eleanor's advancing Alzheimer's not with human empathy, but like an offensive, inconvenient odor she shouldn't have to tolerate in her presence. With a cold, dismissive smirk, she looked straight past me, walked right up to my ailing wife, and had the absolute, breathtaking audacity to mock her quiet confusion right to her face, complaining about how depressing it was to look at. Then, turning back to me with total entitlement, Chloe shamelessly demanded that since maintaining a private home for a dementia patient was impractical and a waste of real estate, my wife and I should immediately pack up our belongings and move into a cheap, state-funded nursing home by the end of the month. That way, the young couple could finally take over the property, gut the house, and modernize it properly for their grand wedding reception. As I stood there quietly at the head of the hallway, watching them parade around my home with such unimaginable cruelty and disrespect, the absolute fury of it all burned deep in my chest. They had no idea what was waiting for them at the end of this table. They thought they were celebrating the glorious dawn of a luxurious new life, completely blind to the fact that the trap had already snapped shut. Thanksgiving dinner concluded without a single word about dessert or polite small talk, leaving only the heavy, suffocating silence of a trap waiting to be sprung. I didn't yell, I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't offer a single angry lecture or wasted threat. Instead, with the cold, deliberate precision of a man who had spent 35 years auditing ghosts and dismantling corporate lies, I simply slid a crisp, plain white envelope across the polished oak dining table, straight toward my son. Marcus stopped mid-sentence, flashing that smug, arrogant grin of his as he picked it up, assuming it was just another boring family lecture or some minor paperwork regarding the house he could easily dismiss. But the moment he pulled out the contents and his eyes scanned the first page, the color completely drained from his face. His expensive swagger evaporated into thin air. Inside wasn't a warning or a request. It was a devastating, fully documented federal wire fraud report, backed by the rock-solid papers of a newly established, irrevocable trust that officially completely disinherited him from my entire estate, locking away every cent of family wealth beyond his reach forever. Yet, the true calculated devastation of the trap went even deeper, striking right at the heart of his parasitic relationship. Buried deep within the federal fraud documentation for the complex shell LLC Marcus had set up to launder the stolen money, I had ensured his gold-digging fiancée, Chloe, was officially listed right beside him as the registered chief financial officer and legal signing authority, a little gift Marcus had arranged behind her back by secretly using her name and signature to shield his own tracks. I didn't look at my son. Instead, I turned my gaze directly to Chloe, keeping my voice entirely steady, low, and cold as ice. "Chloe," I said, "you are listed as the primary corporate officer on these fraudulent federal filings. You have exactly 48 hours to force this boy to return every single cent he stole and liquidated, or you will be spending the next several years sitting in a federal prison cell right beside him as a co-conspirator in wire fraud." The effect was instantaneous and explosive. The mask of loyalty shattered completely in a fraction of a second. Chloe let out a shrill, hysterical shriek of absolute terror and fury, turning on Marcus with the speed of a striking viper. Without a single word of hesitation, she let loose a vicious, open-handed slap that echoed off the dining room walls, sending Marcus staggering back in his chair with a sharp crack. She screamed at the top of her lungs, cursing him for dragging her down into his criminal mess and destroying her future, before ripping off her expensive engagement ring, hurling it straight into his untouched plate, and storming out of the house into the freezing Boston night, slamming the front door behind her. I sat quietly at the head of the table, watching the chaos unfold with absolute unbothered indifference. They had both assumed I was weak, distracted, and defeated. They had absolutely no idea what kind of structural storm they had invited into their lives. The structural noose tightened with the chilling precision of a mechanical clock, leaving Marcus nowhere to run, and no one left to manipulate. Stripped of his arrogant swagger and facing the terrifying, immediate reality of his own financial recklessness, he had no remaining choices. Within 48 hours of Chloe's explosive, door-slamming departure, Marcus was forced into a desperate, humiliating fire sale. He dumped his brand-new luxury Porsche Cayenne and his newly acquired Miami condominium at rock-bottom liquidation prices, just to scrape together enough liquid cash to return every single cent of the $340,000 he had stolen back to Eleanor's specialized medical care fund. But the wheel of natural consequences does not stop turning halfway, and the true weight of his ruin was only just beginning to crash down upon him. Because every single dollar of that stolen fund was successfully clawed back and locked away by the ironclad trust, Marcus suddenly found himself completely, utterly broke, leaving him completely defenseless and unable to satisfy the violent, merciless debts he owed to the underground gambling syndicate. He was entirely trapped in a nightmare of his own design. And the structural retribution went even further, reaching every single person who had conspired against my family. Exercising my decades of hard-earned expertise as a forensic auditor, I quietly compiled and anonymously dropped a meticulously detailed, airtight packet of financial irregularities straight to the IRS regarding Greg, the corrupt local attorney who had notarized the fraudulent power of attorney. Within days, federal investigators swooped in like a storm, stripping Greg of his license to practice law and permanently freezing every single asset and account tied to the complex shell LLC Marcus had created to launder the stolen money. The fragile, glittering illusion of high society wealth vanished into thin air like smoke. Stripped of his safety net, his gold-digging fiancée, his stolen capital, and his legal shields, my son was forced to go completely into hiding, running from dangerous men and working desperate, sleepless night shifts at a rundown, isolated, half-lit gas station on the freezing outskirts of town, just to dodge the loan sharks and avoid being beaten half to death. When he finally tracked down my private number and called me in tears, his voice breaking as he begged for a financial bailout and a second chance to help him escape the state, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scream, curse, or offer a long, wasted lecture. I simply looked down at the phone screen, delivered the ultimate quiet truth of a father who had built the load-bearing walls he chose to tear down, and spoke the final words. You wanted to live like you never had a father, figure it out like one. I hung up the phone, placed it face down on the table, and let the absolute silence of true, unyielding justice settle over the room. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving the snow-covered Boston suburbs buried under a pristine, unbroken blanket of winter white. Inside our home, the air was wrapped in a deep, absolute quiet, the kind of profound stillness that only true structural justice can buy. Eleanor's specialized medical care fund was completely restored and fortified permanently behind an impenetrable fortress of irrevocable trust walls, locked away safely beyond the reach of anyone who would ever dare to calculate her worth or plot against her future. I sat in my favorite worn armchair, right beside the warm, crackling fireplace, carefully spooning hot, nourishing soup for my wife, taking my time with every single movement. The crushing weight I had carried in my chest for months had finally dissolved into thin air. But then, the peaceful evening was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, hurried knock at the front door. I didn't get up immediately, but when I finally checked the porch, I found a single, crumpled handwritten letter pushed half under the welcome mat. It was from Marcus. The pages were smeared with frantic, tear-stained ink, full of desperate apologies and a pleading beggar's request for just a tiny sum of money so he could buy a bus ticket and flee to another state before the loan sharks caught up with him. For a fleeting second, anyone watching might have wondered if an aging father's heart might soften, if the old instinct to rescue his only child one last time would creep back in. Instead, I read the pathetic, whining words from start to finish with a completely blank expression. I didn't shout, I didn't curse, and I didn't feel an ounce of lingering anger or bitterness. Without a single word of hesitation, I picked up the letter and tossed it straight into the roaring flames of the fireplace, watching the ink and paper curl, blacken, and burn down into silent, weightless ash. I turned back toward the kitchen island, and right in that exact sacred moment, Eleanor experienced a sudden, rare, breathtaking window of total lucidity. The fog in her eyes parted completely, her gaze clearing as she looked straight into mine with profound, unmistakable recognition, and she reached out a steady, warm hand to gently touch my face. "Arthur," she whispered softly, her voice filled with a lifetime of love. "You've carried so much. You've worked so hard." I took her frail hand in mine, holding it tightly as a deep, unbreakable peace settled over my entire soul. Thank you for listening. If you believe in quiet justice over loud arguments, do us one quick favor. Hit that subscribe button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and welcome to the real, unyielding strength of a quiet life.